Welcome back to our series on undesigned coincidences, how the different New Testament books fit together and demonstrate their eyewitness accuracy, and in particular, how they describe similar personality traits of people across different events. What about the central character personality, Jesus himself? The four Gospels consistently portray the character of Jesus across many different stories. Here are some categories suggested by Lydia McGrew in her excellent book, Testimonies to the Truth. First, I'll say disconcerting Jesus. Jesus often seemed to not only be aware of what people around him were thinking and doing in secret, but he would make comments that specifically brought up that issue in the person's heart. For example, in Mark 2, Jesus asked the Pharisees why they thought he was blaspheming by claiming to forgive people's sins. In Matthew 12, Jesus knew the Pharisees' thoughts and specifically brought up the issue with them of where his authority to cast out demons came from. In Mark 9, he asked the disciples why they were arguing about which of them was the greatest. In John 1, after Nathanael told Philip, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" Jesus commended Nathanael on being an honest Israelite and said that he saw him while he was under the fig tree. This had a profound effect on Nathanael, and he immediately believed in Jesus as the Messiah. Perhaps Nathanael realized that Jesus knew about his previous skeptical thoughts. In John 4, when the Samaritan woman told Jesus, "I have no husband," Jesus replied, "You have correctly said, I have no husband, for you have had 5 husbands, and the one you now have is not your husband." In John 20, Jesus invited Thomas to touch him and used Thomas' own exact words from the previous week. In John 21, Jesus asked Peter if he loved Jesus more than the other disciples did, echoing Peter's words before his death that he would never abandon Jesus even if all the other disciples did. As Lydia McGrew writes, all these incidents taken together give us a vivid understanding of what it must have been like to be with Jesus. If there was something you didn't want him to bring up, he was almost sure to bring it up. You never knew when he would reveal things you prefer not to have revealed. End quote. And this same pattern shows across the Gospels. Next, there was Jesus' habitual pattern of teaching with object lessons. For example, in Mark 3, Matthew 12, and Luke 8, when Jesus' mother and brothers came to try to take him away because they thought he was out of his mind, he used that situation to make the point that whoever does the will of God is Jesus' brother, sister, or mother. In Matthew 16, when the disciples were worried because they had forgotten to get bread, Jesus used that to teach them to beware of the leaven of the Pharisees and Sadducees. In Mark 10, Jesus used a situation where the disciples had tried to stop parents from bringing their children to him to teach them that we must enter the kingdom of heaven like a little child. In Matthew 18 and Mark 9, Jesus again taught a similar theme, this time calling a child in front of them as an example for the lesson. In John 6, when the crowd of people was following Jesus after he'd miraculously given them bread, Jesus used that as an object lesson that he is the bread of life. In John 7, at the water pouring festival ceremony at the feast, Jesus began teaching that anyone who was thirsty should come to him and drink. In John 9, when they passed by a blind man, Jesus used that as an illustration that to teach that he is the light of the world before healing the man, and then later used a similar analogy to teach that the Pharisees were blind because they refused to believe in him. In John 13 and Luke 22, Jesus laid aside his garments, put on a towel, and washed his disciples' feet, and then used that as an example that they should serve each other with the same attitude. Another characteristic of Jesus that comes through from multiple Gospels is his wittiness and use of wordplay. For example, in Luke 13, Jesus healed a woman on the Sabbath day, but the synagogue official was upset and started telling the crowd to only get healed on other days. But Jesus replied, "You hypocrites, does not each of you on the Sabbath untie his ox or lead him his donkey from the stall and lead him away to water him? And this woman, a daughter of Abraham as she is, whom Satan has bound for 18 long years, should she not have been released from this bond on the Sabbath day?" Jesus uses the same word for the Pharisees untying or loosing their animals on the Sabbath compared to his releasing or loosing this woman from her 18 years of sickness. Jesus shows a similar pattern of reasoning in John 7. He had previously healed a crippled man in Jerusalem on the Sabbath in John 5. The Pharisees started plotting to kill him. Now he asked why the Pharisees were so upset if they themselves were willing to circumcise a baby on the Sabbath if that happened to be 8 days after birth. But here Jesus had made a whole man well on the Sabbath. In Matthew 23, Jesus criticized the Pharisees for tithing mint, dill, and cumin, while neglecting the weightier provisions of the law, a play on words, because they were willing to spend lots of time figuring out their tithe for very lightweight herbs, but they neglected the weightier things. They strained out a gnat and swallowed a camel, so to speak. There are many such examples of Jesus' witty sayings and criticisms found across different Gospels, but it's the same witty Jesus portrayed. Jesus also had an ironic sense of humor and made appropriately sarcastic comments sometimes. In Luke 13, Jesus commented that it cannot be that a prophet would perish outside Jerusalem. In John 10, Jesus asked the Pharisees, I showed you many good works from the Father. For which of them are you stoning me? Same ironic sense of humor. In John 5, Jesus ironically points out that the religious leaders were rejecting him for coming in God's name. But if another person would come in their own name, as a self-promotion focused leader, they would have accepted such a person. In Matthew 12 and many other places shown here, Jesus responded to the Pharisees' complaints by citing the Old Testament scriptures with this question, have you not read? Of course, everyone knew that they had read it, but they had not understood it or applied it to their lives. So this personality of appropriate sarcasm is seen in different conversations, different events in the Gospels, related by those different Gospels. Finally, Jesus experienced the emotional weight of the loneliness and rejection that he experienced from his own people. And this comes through in different conversations and events from all the Gospels. In John 6, a lot of Jesus' disciples began to stop following him, and Jesus asked his 12 disciples if they wanted to leave too. In Luke 19, Jesus wept over the city of Jerusalem because it did not repent and believe in him. In John 13, Jesus was troubled in spirit because one of his own closest disciples was going to betray him. Also, Jesus predicted his own death and resurrection many different times in different settings, recorded in all the Gospels. Lydia McGrew calls this the I told you so Jesus. Here are a few of those conversations. There are many more examples. Here are some examples from all four Gospels where Jesus was grieved or troubled in spirit, not just from his rejection and betrayal from his friends and countrymen, but the upcoming suffering he was about to undergo in suffering God's wrath for us. He was not a stoic man who bottled up all his emotions internally. Rather, he fully felt and expressed his grief at what he was going through. And all the Gospels present a consistent picture of Jesus' attitude, grieving and suffering and crying out to his Father, but pressing on through grief. So the consistent picture we get of Jesus' personality across these different events in different Gospels is basically an undesigned coincidence, showing that these are accurate, eyewitness-based historical reportings.